Well, good morning, everybody. Good to see you here this morning. I want to start out by saying, first of all, I hope you had a great Thanksgiving. And if you're new with us today, I'm glad you came. We're wrapping up a series today called Reassembly Required. And I thought to myself, how can I make this something that you'd remember? And hopefully walk away saying, okay, now I've got to remember to do this. Anybody know what this is? A mop. Wow, great. All right. How many wives just elbowed your husband? This is, a mop. And what do you use it for? You use it to clean a dirty floor, right? And you maybe have footprints to get up. You know what I'm talking about? Just dirty marks all over the floor. And you get it and you make sure and you go back and forth. Sometimes you have to scrub really hard, okay? But you do this to clean the floor, right? This is what you use to clean the floor. But the problem is that once you clean the floor, you know what happens? The floor gets dirty again, okay? And so you have to continue to bring the mop out. And you may even feel like your work is never done, It's one thing to clean the floor. It's another thing to keep it clean, Because it's hard to keep something clean, isn't it? Because the more you use something, the more it gets dirty. The more there's stuff in the way or stuff people go in and out, And you have to make sure that you are doing everything possible to keep it clean. That's hard to do. It's hard to do it. You ever tried, and probably you had, I don't know if you hosted Thanksgiving this year, but you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? You clean your house all up, and then everybody shows up, and then they go home, and the house is a wreck, right? Especially if you have grandchildren or you have your kids and you invite all of the cousins and everybody comes over and it's like, how do we have this much stuff everywhere now? It was all perfect and in place. Some of you maybe even decorate before Christmas. It looks more like, you could call in FEMA after the day is over, because it's so rough, I want you to think of it in this term. Think about your relationships that you have in your life, and what is it like to keep them where they should be, and what's it like to actually clean them up and get them rolling? Sometimes it feels like you gotta go in and mop up the mess all the time, right? You have a mess that you're experiencing right now, or maybe you recently did, or you know someone who's experiencing a mess. We've been in Matthew 18 for the last few weeks, and Matthew was one of Jesus' disciples who captured the story of Jesus' life and everything that he taught. And he taught this one sermon about human relationships and how it was going to be in the future. He was preparing them for when he wasn't going to be there anymore and getting them used to how they were going to have to deal with each other and how to keep the group of people around him, the ones who had claimed him as their Savior, those who had believed and had begun to follow Jesus. How were they going to be able to keep that together? Well, I want to ask you a big question because I think this is one of the things that gets in the way the most. Are there limits to forgiveness? Are there limits to forgiveness? Because we all say there's got to be somebody who just won't cooperate. Last week we talked about how you go to someone and then you find trusted friends and you take them and then you just keep bringing people into the life of this other person so that they will finally understand the severity of the situation. Either they were going down a path that they shouldn't be, or they've got a broken relationship in their life that you're trying to help mend, or you're mending it even for yourself and you're trying to figure out how to do that. Well, sometimes, though, it's like I do it over and over and over and over again. Is this ever going to end? Is this ever going to come to? I feel like all I'm doing is just keeping things clean. I'm just always constantly mopping up the mess. in this relationship, or this person is really struggling in their life, and they have this I'll use even Celebrate Recovery terms. They have this hurt or this habit or this hang up in their life, and they just keep going back and doing it over and over and over again and hurting themselves. And you're thinking to yourself, how can I help them? How can I keep them from doing this? And you feel like you're mopping up messes all the time. It just feels like that's all that there is in your life is a mess. And how do I deal with that? How can I deal with it? So I ask you the question, if we're supposed to forgive, I want to ask, are there limits to forgiveness? And I want you to remember this one thing today. This is pretty important, because when we think of forgiveness, we may in our minds be thinking about something we do to cause someone to behave differently. If I forgive them, then they will do this and everything will be good, right? How many of you have tried that? You've tried to forgive somebody, and when you've forgiven them, then they still come back to the old way and they do it again. They do it again and again. You can't just come in and mop one time, right? In the relationship or in the situation. It feels like you are just mopping all the time to clean it up. So what do? Are there limits? Well, remember this thought, all right? Because this is the foundation of it all. This is what Jesus was teaching to his disciples and to the future of his followers, the church. And this is what he said, this is what it sums up to be. He didn't say these words. Forgiving someone is more about our relationship with God than our relationship with that person. So it comes down to it that forgiving someone is really not about the other person, the person you're forgiving. The forgiveness issue has to do with your relationship with God. And Jesus made it very clear. He actually had a question that he answered, and then he told a story that helped them understand. So I'm going to tell you that story today, and so you can understand it. And it's like this, too. One of the keys that we all have to understand, and actually this should be like the litmus test. It's like the thing that measures whether or not we truly are following Jesus. And let me just say this. It's one thing, and we actually talked about this. I've talked about it before, but let me remind you of this. And if you're new, this will be maybe new to you, but listen to the concept. Do you believe in Jesus? That he existed, that part of the story this time of year, you think, okay, yeah, Christmas, the true meaning is his birth and everything. Yes, I believe Jesus lived, and I believe a lot of things about him. But the real question is not just do you believe in Jesus, but do you believe Jesus? Do you believe him for what he says and who he said he was and who he says we are and what he came to do, which was to save us and forgive us of our sin and to actually deal with the thing that we couldn't deal with on our own. So if that's all true and we consider this, it's one thing to believe in Jesus, but do you believe what he says? If you do, then you can really have the foundation of what it is to actually have sin forgiven in your life. You can trust him for that. Believe that he died and rose again. You can have that true forgiveness in your life. But Jesus never once said, believe me. He always said, follow me. He always said to his disciples, follow me. So if you're really wanting to do that, that means Jesus is literally leading your life. The things he taught on, everything he shared, those were the things that we do. So we follow Jesus. So you think of people that you maybe work for or have worked for in the past. You follow them or follow their lead or whatever they do. That's an important part. When we are following Jesus, we are listening to everything he says. So I believe, given the principles and the things that Jesus taught in this Matthew 18, the whole chapter really, when we see it, we know this, that forgiveness is a true mark of a Christ follower. It's kind of that test. Are you really following Jesus? You may believe Jesus, or you might even be at that stage where you just believe in Jesus, but are you following Jesus? And that's been a big theme we've talked about all year long, and the marks of what that looks like. But this one is the one that kind of makes it stand out. So if you're struggling with forgiveness in your life, you're probably struggling a little bit, just like any of us do, struggling with following Jesus. Because Jesus said forgiveness is the key. So I want to take you to the story in Matthew chapter 18. And it starts out, though, with this. Jesus had already talked all about how relationships work. He had already told a story about a lost sheep and how important it was to pursue the lost sheep and to go after them, never give up, and always to go after them. But Matthew 18:21 starts us out where Peter's actually doing that. So let's go to that verse. It says here, and after he was teaching, we don't know whether or not Jesus wrapped up the sermon and he walked off to the side a little bit and then Peter got his attention there, or whether Peter just in the back, like to say, teacher, I've got to ask another thing. Rabbi, please tell me this. How do you deal with this? How do you do it? I have a question, I could believe that Peter would do that because I think he trusted Jesus enough and had heard him teach enough that he knew that if he asked the question, that Jesus would have a good answer. He says, then Peter came to Jesus and asked. He just asked the question, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Who are we talking about? We're talking about other people who are claiming to believe Jesus, who are claiming to follow Jesus. How do I do it if they sin against me? Up to 7 times? Because 7 was a number that they used a lot. It was considered a perfect number, okay? And so if you have a 7-year-old, you know that they're perfect, okay? And so you get this idea of being, this idea of how do you do this? What do you do? So then Jesus gave him an answer. He gave him an answer that I think probably troubled Peter a little bit. We don't know that for sure, but it kind of, in the way that he was doing it, and it was kind of an over-the-top answer, okay? He said this, Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. One of the translations of Scripture says 70 times 7, Wow, that's a lot of times to forgive you. That's a lot of times to keep coming back and cleaning things up or mopping up after the mess, right? That's a lot of times to have to keep doing it. And the point really comes down to that Jesus is trying to make to him is that forgiveness, if it's limited, it's really not forgiveness. Because if you forgive somebody the first time, then the principle of why you forgive them still stands. It's still in place. I would tell you this, that you've got to forgive without keeping count. You have to forgive without keeping count. I don't know if you've ever been in the situation, the circumstance where you have a thing going on. And this is Jesus' words, remember? He doesn't say, you know what, I've had enough of this person, and I'm not going to forgive them ever again. If they came to me and were sincere and wanted to apologize and make it right, then I'm going to do that. The first impulse for a Christ follower is to follow this pattern of his teaching to say, I'm going to offer grace and mercy. That's the thing I'm going to do. I'm going to forgive them. So in a sense, it's a way for us to understand Jesus. It's a very simple, straightforward statement that he's making. So in trying to put back a relationship, where does forgiveness ever draw a limit? Are you willing to forgive? It's hard. I got to tell you, there have been things in my life where I think to myself, how could I ever forgive that person for what they did? I did everything I could to help them. I did everything I could to offer myself. I will sit down and I will talk to you. Let's talk this through, please. Let's don't do this. Why would you turn your back on the relationship and not be willing to talk it through to come to resolution? And unfortunately, that just happens. But I know this, that I've been told that if that person comes to me or those people come to me and they say, listen, Greg, I want to make this right with you, I can't just say, no, sorry. I put up a boundary and a barrier and I cannot see your face, all right? I'll be happy just to see you in heaven. Okay? I can't do that. Why? Because Jesus said an over-the-top kind of number. So he was trying to he was using hyperbole, get it? I mean, he was saying not 7 times, 77 times. How's that? You just got to keep doing it. So I say this to you. Forgiveness will always test your following ability. It will always test whether or not you're truly following Jesus. Because, and this is a tough one, You know, I was thinking, wow, Thanksgiving weekend, I should make jokes about turkeys and all kinds of stuff. But then I thought to myself, you know, we've all come off of family. We've all come off of time with people. And let's just face it, the last couple of years have been tough where it just like people are really it's stirred up and all kinds of things. We just came out of an election cycle. And it's just like, what do we do? There's so much division and it seems like hate and anger going on. How do we deal with all of that? Do we do anything? And I'll just tell you, forgiveness will test your following ability. You may say, I believe Jesus. I believe Jesus, but he understands why this is bad. He understands what this person has done to me. He understands what has happened. Actually, Jesus would say, yeah, I do. I died for it. I understand that. So I take you back to this thing, and so he tells a story. Jesus is like, okay, I get it, Peter. You need a little more than just that, all right? Peter always wanted more. He always wanted more and wanted Jesus to explain it to the nth degree. I mean, he wanted more and more. And so you go back to Matthew 18, and this is where Jesus picks it up. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. This idea, his kingdom, the way Jesus was teaching everyone to live. If you're going to be a follower of Jesus, then you become part of his kingdom. You represent him as your leader. You're following him. That's what the kingdom means. Whenever you're wondering when Jesus talks about the kingdom, what is it? We live in it now. We represent it, and it will go on forever. All right? And Jesus is the leader, and he's the king of it. I'm excited for Christmas. Next week, we start a series called, now I'm going to forget it. See, I had that, and no other king, thank you very much. Wow. It goes with the song we sing, and it's really a great song. It's all of that, but there's no other king that would approach it this way. So Jesus put it in the context of his kingdom and the idea of the one who leads it, the king, who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. Now, this is what happens. He starts to bring his servants in, and he has them in front of him, and he starts to explain to them how important it is for them to settle up their debts. So he was going to bring them in and ask them to settle their debts, come up with a payment plan, do something like this. So he brings in one guy, and he owes, in modern day debt, it was an unbelievable amount. Now, Jesus is telling a story here. We don't really have any feeling that this was a real thing. He was just illustrating with this fictitious story that Jesus was teaching. He did that many times with his parables. And so as he's teaching this, he explains this and gives them this idea of what was going on, and it either made people understand it better or it confused them to where they needed more or they just walked away. And so Jesus is giving this idea, and he says, this king brought all of his servants together, these people that worked for him, these people that had signed an agreement to be his servant and to be owned by him to be doing this. They would do that many times, just like signing up for the military. People would sign up to be servants of people like kings and rulers and leaders. And depending on your status, your social status of the day, it would be the thing to do. So Jesus is telling this story of something that was going on in the culture. He in no way is like saying, I condone slavery or anything like that. Please don't get off onto a tangent of something that's going on here. Jesus didn't condone that. And this is, he's doing this, and so he tells the king, brings all of his servants in front of him, and he starts to tell them each, and he gets to this one, and he says, he just makes this astronomical amount, okay? Now, you know a debt level right now that if you were asked to pay it on the spot, you wouldn't be able to do it, okay? So let's just come up with a number that's just outrageous, all right, in here. Let's say $1 billion. Okay, anybody here that could pay on the spot a debt of $1 billion? If you raise your hand, then we want to talk to you, okay? Here's the thing. Here's the thing, the circumstance is that it was an astronomical amount that Jesus gave. There's no way he could have paid that debt, all right? Couldn't have paid it. And so what's he do? The man says, "Oh, please help me. You know, I don't know. I don't know I don't know how to do it." So this is what happens. The next verses say, at this, when he said, we need your payment. If you don't pay, the king said to him, if you don't pay, we're going to have you and your family all sold to another person until you can work off your debt with me, which was ridiculous. He was going to, his wife, his children, everybody would have had to have gone in and worked for another man or another king or someone to do that. And then you're going to pay it all back to me. And you're going to sell everything you have right now, and I'm going to get all the proceeds for that. And so the man, when he heard this, he says, at this, the servant fell on his knees before him. No, be patient with me. Be patient with me, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. I mean, it would be like walking into the bank and saying, I've got student loans out the wazoo. Could you please help me? And they say, sure, paid in full. Please help me. I can't make these payments. I can't do this. You get the idea, right? So what happens? Well, he goes out and being forgiven that debt, you talk about a weight off his shoulders. He goes out and what happens? He bumps into someone who owes him money, another fellow servant, someone who serves the same king. And he goes to him and he doesn't just say, hey man, I'm gonna need that money. Maybe by Tuesday, okay? He doesn't do that. He goes up, grabs him by the collar, basically, and shoves him against the wall to the point he's choking him. Okay? And he says, pay me back everything you owe me right now. And the man says, so he lets off, I'm sure. You get the idea though, right? He is pushing this. He had just been shown an incredible amount of grace. And then what happens? He goes to this man and says, his fellow servant. And so what happens? This is what happens. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me and I will pay it back. Does this sound familiar? Does this sound familiar? Well, you know what the guy did, right? I mean, this guy had been shown mercy, unbelievable mercy for a debt he would have never been able to pay. And so what's he do to this guy who owes him money? This is what happens. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. At a debtor's prison. And you had to go there and you did hard labor in that debtor's prison. Filthy conditions, all that. He has this man thrown in jail because he owed him a small amount. We're talking in the amount that Jesus was using, it would be like one man owed $1 billion and the other man owed like $10. So you get the idea of how small that was, and he couldn't forgive that. He couldn't forgive it. He refused. So you know what happened? All the servants heard what happened, that their friend had been thrown in prison because he owed this small amount to this man. So they go to the king and tell him, Master, this is what's happened. Well, this is what happened. The king got angry over the whole thing. You know, as a person who's trying to figure it out, he says, you wicked servant. He brought him in. He said, you wicked servant, I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? Shouldn't you know, come on. Really? Why did you do that? I gave you mercy. Why didn't you show him mercy? The master decided that's just not going to work. It's not going to work. You can't do it that way. Do you remember this principle? You remember this? The whole concept of what Jesus was trying to get across to him is that many times we hold these small things and grudges when we've been given so much grace and mercy in our life. Who's the giver of that grace and mercy that we don't deserve? It's God himself. God offers us grace and mercy when we don't deserve it at all. And he forgives multiple times. I mean, I'm sure that if you decided to follow Jesus, you didn't stop sinning. I know that. I've experienced that over and over and over and over and over again in my life. And you know, every time I do, Jesus is there to forgive me. That is, when I come and I'm willing to accept it. Can you see that the man he's talking about here, this wicked servant who just wouldn't do it, he wanted only what he wanted for himself, but wasn't willing to offer that to anyone else. It was all about him. It wasn't about other people. It wasn't about showing that forgiveness and showing that grace and mercy. It all had to do with what he wanted from the king. So he begged him, and he forgave his debt. He finds another man who owes him, and what's he do? He has him thrown in prison. It's incredible, the story. Well, I want to remind you of the point that I had us talk about at the beginning, and it's this. Forgiving someone is more about our relationship with God than our relationship with that person. Okay? And remember this, forgiveness is a true mark of a Christ follower. Jesus is making it clear that this man who was the wicked servant, he had no desire to really follow the king, to act on his principles. And so much so, Jesus makes this clear statement in the next verse, and this is how he kind of brings it together. He says, "This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart." In other words, I'm going to weed out those of you who really don't mean business about following. God takes this very seriously. Matter of fact, in this idea of treating us this way, it seems like, well, that doesn't seem like it's right, but God knew the sincerity of the heart. God knows our heart. He knows whether or not we are sincere about following him or not. It takes a sincere person who decides to actually say, yes, you're right. But if someone continues to have a problem, what do? You continue to do what you're expected to do, and that's to forgive them. That gives the example of what God does, but they have to act on the sincerity. We can't in any way change them. It's not about getting someone to change their behavior toward you or me. It has nothing to do. If I go to someone and trying to make things right, and all I'm wanting to see is just the different way they act, I want it to be deep in their heart if I'm going to go this far, because it's affected me deep in my heart. It's a hard reality for a lot of us to see. Matter of fact, I want you to think about this, but let's put hard reality up here. Hard reality in itself of all this situation is Jesus saying God takes this seriously. Many times we think we just cruise along and we're going to do the things we want, and God doesn't take that seriously. But if you at times say, God seems so far from me, or God seems so distant, or how can I know? So I have so many doubts in my mind about whether God is real from time to time. I believe, I've believed in the past, I've done all of this, or yes, I'm trying to follow, but there just seems to be these issues for me. Let me just tell you, the hard reality is this, that if we cannot do the basics of following Jesus, then we're going to sense that there's a barrier. It's going to feel like the distance is there. It's going to feel like that we don't have that. And you know what? We're the ones who move when that happens. God's not the one moving. Let me just tell you something. God would mop up our messes all the time. Matter of fact, he did. But God can handle mercy and justice. It's not our job to go after somebody and to make them change and do this. That's not our job. That's God's job to work in their hearts and their lives. Our job is to show them what the mercy and grace of God is about. So our job is not whether to determine whether someone needs mercy or gets mercy, or whether they need justice or get justice. We're not supposed to be the one doing that. That's not our responsibility. God can handle that. God is big enough to handle that. And I even say this, we have to give the same grace and mercy. We have to give that same grace and mercy that we've been given. That's the only way that it works. That's the only way that it comes out. Matter of fact, the whole point of following Jesus shows us that we really needed the grace and mercy in our own life, and that's what empowers us or enables us to be able to show that grace and mercy to someone else. So you may be in a relationship now, and you may be thinking, all I do is mop up the messes. Are you cleaning it? Or are you trying to keep it clean? I think the idea is that for us, keeping it clean is our role. We keep going, we keep forgiving, because ultimately, the win in all of this, the win in the whole thing has to do with whether or not people turn their hearts, other people turn their hearts toward Jesus, and they follow him. And we're the ones who can be that expression of forgiveness, that expression of grace and mercy. And so how many times do we forgive? Does forgiveness have a limit? No. No. Because it wasn't limited when God looked at us. And so when God looked at the person you may be having struggle with, or you're trying to reassemble a relationship with them, does he limit forgiveness to them? No.